They told you inflation was coming down, and technically on paper they were right. The rate of price increases slowed down, the headlines celebrated loudly, the politicians took credit. And then you went to the actual grocery store, and your bill was still 40% higher than it was 3 years ago. And nobody had a satisfying or good explanation for that. So naturally you did what most people do. You assumed that prices would eventually drift back down. You waited, and they never did. And here is the part that nobody in the financial media wants to say out loud. They were never going to. Because what the headlines called a victory over inflation was never actually a promise that your cost of living would return to normal. It was just a promise that prices would stop rising as fast. And those are two very different things. One is a finish line, the other is just a slower treadmill. And today I want to explain exactly why that is. Because this isn't an accident. It isn't a market failure. It is the system working precisely as it was designed to work. And once you understand the mechanics behind it, the confusion goes away. It gets replaced by something else entirely. So let's start with what inflation actually is. Because the official definition and the lived experience of it are not the same thing. When economists say inflation is falling, what they mean is that the rate of increase is slowing down. Prices are still going up, just not as fast as before. So if something cost $1 in 2020, and it cost $1.40 by 2023, inflation coming down does not mean it goes back to $1. It means next year it might cost $1.43 instead of $1.50. The starting point never resets. The clock never runs backward, and the gap between where prices were and where they are now is permanent. This is the part that gets lost in translation between economists and everyone else. Because to an economist, inflation cooling down is genuinely good news. But to a family doing their weekly grocery run, lower inflation still means higher prices than before. The victory lap was real, it just wasn't for you. This is what economists call price stickiness. But what it actually means in plain language is that prices are like a ratchet. They click up very easily, but the mechanism to click them back down barely exists. Raising prices is a decision one company makes internally. Lowering prices would require every competitor in the market to move at the same time. Because if one grocery chain cuts prices and the others don't, the one that cuts looks cheaper, gains customers, and wins. In theory. But in practice, most companies in most industries are watching each other very carefully. Nobody wants to be the first to blink. Nobody wants to voluntarily shrink their own margins when the competitor next door is holding firm. So the prices hold, not because of a secret agreement, just because of math and self-interest, which turns out to be more than enough. And then something else happened during the inflation years that made this even worse. Because a lot of companies discovered something surprising while raising their prices. They discovered that consumers kept buying anyway. Not happily, not without complaint, but they kept buying. Because what is the alternative? You still need groceries, you still need gas, you still need the basics. So companies learned that their customers had less price sensitivity than they thought. And that lesson did not disappear when inflation cooled down. In fact, some companies went further. They started using inflation as cover for something more deliberate. The costs went up, yes, but the prices went up more than the costs did. And when costs came back down, the prices stayed up. Because by then the higher price had become the new normal. Consumers had adjusted, complaints had faded. And the margin expansion was quietly locked in. This is not a conspiracy theory. Company earnings reports from 2022 and 2023 show profit margins expanding even as the inflation narrative was at its peak. The language in those reports is almost admirably honest. Pricing power, favorable pricing environment, consumers absorbing higher price points. The mechanism was visible to anyone paying attention. And look, I want to be fair here. Not every price increase during this period was a cynical cash grab. Real costs did go up. Supply chains were genuinely broken. Energy was genuinely expensive. Labor costs genuinely rose. Shipping costs exploded. Some of what you paid extra was entirely justified by what was happening on the cost side. But some of it was also opportunity. Because when every company in every industry is raising prices at the same time, and consumers are used to seeing higher prices everywhere they look, it becomes very easy to raise your own prices a little further than the cost increase actually required. Nobody notices, nobody can compare. The noise covers the signal. And companies are not obligated to tell you which part of your price increase was cost recovery and which part was margin expansion. That information lives in their quarterly earnings reports, not on your receipt. So here is where we land. Inflation goes up, companies raise prices. Some of the increase reflects real costs. Some of it reflects the discovery that you will pay more than you used to. Inflation comes back down, real costs ease, but the prices that were raised for both reasons only fall for one of them. The opportunistic portion stays, and over time that is the part that compounds. And what makes this especially hard to talk about is that it is entirely legal. There is no regulator whose job it is to say, your costs came down, so your prices have to follow. The market is supposed to handle that through competition, and sometimes it does. But in the places where it hurts most, groceries, rent, healthcare, insurance, the competition is often weak enough, and the switching costs high enough, that the pressure to lower prices almost never materializes. So the market mechanism that is supposed to protect you quietly fails, and the gap stays. The official numbers do look fine, because they are measuring the rate of change, not the level. Not the gap between where things were and where they are now, just how fast things are currently moving. And when the rate of change is low, the headline says inflation is under control, even if the damage from the previous years is still sitting there, fully intact, in every price tag in every store. This is why the economy can look healthy on paper and feel broken in your daily life at the same time. It is not a contradiction. It is not confusion. It is not a misunderstanding of economics. It is just a measurement problem dressed up as a policy victory. The number being reported is technically accurate. It is just not measuring the thing that actually matters to you. And that distinction gets lost every single time the headline runs. And this is the pattern that keeps repeating, not just with inflation, but with rent, with healthcare, with education, with anything that has gone through a significant price increase in the last decade. Once the price goes up and stays up long enough to feel normal, it does not come back down. The new price becomes the floor, and the next increase builds on top of that floor. So the next time you see a headline celebrating falling inflation, ask one question. Falling from what? Because the answer to that question will tell you everything about whether the good news is actually good for you. And if the answer is falling from a level that was already 40% above where you started, then the celebration is real. It is just not yours. And that is the thing about the financial system that traditional media consistently gets wrong. They report the direction. They almost never report the level. They tell you the fever is breaking. They do not tell you the patient is still in the hospital. And understanding that difference is the only way to actually read what is happening to your money. Because your lived experience is data too. And sometimes, it turns out, it is considerably more accurate than the official version. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. Because the gap between what the headlines say and what is actually happening to your wallet is exactly where this channel lives. And that gap, it turns out, is very large.